Not just recovery being possible for every person who is willing to work for it, but triumphs in recovery. The word triumph, and it has a loaded meaning, doesn't it? We often think of, something huge, something monumental, a monumental victory or achievement against the most incredibly difficult situation or event. Yet I'm sure I'm not the only person in this room here tonight who has had to overcome some great personal difficulties. But most of us, regardless of what we have overcome, do not see our recovery as triumphant. I hope you will reconsider this and perhaps leave here tonight seeing yourselves a little different. You don't have to have a dramatic story to be triumphant in recovery. And as you'll see from my own recovery story, it was the small victories and simple achievements that ultimately created a pathway of having success in recovery. It was also the support and willingness of providers to collaborate and work together to create a solid foundation that gave me the courage to take those small risks, the ones that led to the victories on which my recovery is built on today. So I want to start at the beginning. I was born to a teenage mother who was escaping from her own home life into a marriage with my father, who was much, much older than her. And although my father offered her much needed stability, with a lot of love in the home, there was also a lot of dysfunction. Now my parents, they did the best they could, but they could not give me what they did not have to give themselves. So at times, it was a struggle. And those insecurities as a young child made me feel very different and separate from those around me. I remember one night crawling into my parents' bed and talking to my mom about this, and telling her that I felt different from everyone. And although she didn't understand me, she reassured me that I was loved and I always would be. Unfortunately, there was an event that was about to occur that catapulted me into addiction and mental illness. But my story is not unique this way though, as trauma is the highway to addiction and mental illness for many, many people. Unbeknownst to anyone, I was molested by a friend of the family at the age of 9. And this abuse went on for about 9 months, until the man and his family moved away. And this was when the nightmares and sleepless nights began for me. As a child, I remember seeing and hearing adults around me laughing and being happy when they were drinking alcohol. And I wanted to be happy again. I just wanted the nightmares to stop. I knew that in our kitchen's food pantry there were bottles of alcohol, so I began to sneak drinks at night when the nightmares would come in the hopes that I would just be able to go relax and go to sleep. But what my abuser had taught me in those 9 months was how to keep secrets. And I learned to go to any length to keep those secrets. I graduated very quickly in my addiction. At the age of 12, I had moved on to pain pills because they were easily available from home and the doctor's office. And by the time I was 16, I had been introduced to methamphetamine by some older friends. Despite using heavy drugs, I was able to keep my grades up in school and fool everybody around me by performing well. As long as I had good grades and I did well at sports, no one caught on. And upon graduation, I was accepted into University of California, Santa Barbara. But by then, my alcoholism and addiction had taken over. And 3 months into my freshman year, I was date raped. Again, I blamed myself, believing that I deserved it. Once again, I kept a secret. It didn't take long before the last bolt of being able to cope and function was just completely gone. And I ended up failing out of college that year. From there, my life took an extreme downhill slide. I dove even harder into drugs and alcohol, and I got into an abusive relationship that lasted 15 years. Drug abuse and domestic violence took me to new lows, ones I could never have imagined. My husband and I were both heavily addicted to meth. Beatings, verbal and sexual abuse were all common daily occurrences for me. Neither of us could hold steady employment, and homelessness, it just became a way of life for us, despite having 3 young daughters together. The drugs hit a lot of my mental health symptoms that I was experiencing, but they increasingly became worse and worse with every passing day. The depression, compulsive behavior, Traumatic nightmares and drug-induced psychotic episodes were making my life unmanageable. Until one day, I could no longer deny that I was out of control and I needed help. I remember that day very painfully. My husband and I had recently moved from living in a tent in someone's backyard to renting a room from a friend, and all 5 of us were staying in that room. My youngest was just a baby, and my husband and I we'd been using methamphetamine all week long, and we had no sleep for the last 24 hours. We'd been arguing all morning, and eventually I'd gotten beaten again. I'm unsure even now who had called the police that day, whether it was a neighbor or the friend we were living with. So without knowing that the police were called, I picked up my youngest and I walked to the end of the driveway. I was bloody and bruised, and I had my crying baby in my arms, and I was just down there waiting for my husband to calm down. And then the police arrived. My husband was already on domestic violence probation already, so he was immediately removed from the residence. And then the cop came over, the sheriff, he came over. And I remember the fear I felt as that sheriff approached me. Here I was with bruises on my face, willing to lie for my husband again. When the sheriff asked me if I was on something and if I was high, again I lied. It's what I knew to do. And in my head, I believed I was still very good at keeping secrets. But clearly a lifetime of secrets had eaten away at the dignity I had left. And at that moment, it was completely gone. But there was something about this particular sheriff. I mean, who knows how many times he'd been called out to domestic violence disputes during his career. But I can tell you how he treated me in that moment. He spoke to me with such empathetic and genuine concern, and he reassured me that although there would be some consequences, he was ultimately there to help me and my children. He told me if I voluntarily went with him and tested, that I could get right out and get some help. He told me that I did not have to live this way anymore. And if I did not want to, in that moment, I made the decision. I was handcuffed and taken to the police station. Right before I walked in to take the drug test, which I knew I was going to test dirty for, I broke down and I told the sheriff, "Sir, I'm a meth addict, and my life has been hell, and I don't want to live like this anymore." That was the moment of the beginning of the end of my secrets. That moment was a small victory. I got lucky that day because the sheriff that arrested me cared and took the time to talk to me about services available to me. I was allowed to go right home to my children, where I quickly gathered them and left with only the clothes on our backs. I moved in with my grandmother and started working a program for drug addicts, and attended my first Alcoholics Anonymous meeting. I also started into successful therapy for the first time in my life. A few years later, with the help of the domestic violence shelter, I moved to Santa Maria, where I still live now. Now, I would like to tell you that it got continuously better from there, but that is not how recovery actually works. I hadn't had enough small victories yet, and there were still secrets left to voice. I continued to struggle, but now my mental health symptoms were becoming much more apparent. The years of abuse, alcohol, and drugs, they had left me severely traumatized, and I was hearing voices. Too scared to acknowledge the voices to anyone, I kept that I was hearing them a secret. Then one day, after receiving some bad news about my ability to go back to school, one of the voices told me to kill myself in a very particular way. And it scared the heck out of me. I left school and I ran home, covering my ears, and I told my case manager for the first time about my voices. I got help that day, and I went to the mental health hospital, and I believe there was a lot of people that helped save my life that day. I placed my daughters in the care of their father, now sober and working on himself. When I got out of the hospital, although I was fragile and confused, I started to focus on my mental health recovery. But about a year later, the unthinkable happened, and my mother, who was very sick, ended her life by suicide in bed one night next to me. and I found her that morning. I was in shock and I completely went into myself. I began sleeping 20 hours a day. I stopped communicating. And my mental health medications were doubled, and my weight went up to over 350 pounds. I lived like this for a couple more years, but homelessness and living in poor conditions, they had been a problem for me most of my life. I continued to scrape by, but I was still just one step away from lying my head back on that street. I struggled living in poverty in the cheapest motel I could find, as it was the only one I could afford on Social Security. But I had an excellent case manager at the time that was willing to push me out of my comfort zone. And he gave me a referral to a place called the Recovery Learning Center. Here in San Luis, they're called the Wellness Centers. And he said, give this place a chance, they can help you. Cathie, go check it out. I was told that they give food away every Tuesday, so I attended because I was hungry and I needed help with the food. All of my money was going to rent. You know, at first, I wasn't going to talk to anyone when I went there. Just go in, get my food, leave. That's all I was going to do. However, this place was different, as everything there was pure run. Once again, I had providers and staff willing to speak and interact with me like I was a whole person. When I got up the courage, I tried another group, and I began to come out of my shell. For the first time in many years, I began to make friends. And for the first time, I was sitting in groups where others were telling their secrets and realizing that I wasn't alone in this. These were the small victories and the simple achievements of getting up, getting dressed, and going to this program that were building my confidence and leading me towards the life I would eventually have today. But I didn't know it then. About a year later, an employment opportunity for a peer staff position became available at the Recovery Learning Center, and the staff took a chance on me and I was hired. Within a few months, I began working at that same food bank that I originally attended in so much need. I not only got a lot of healing there, but I also attended trainings, which made me a better employee and also helped me learn about my own illnesses. I had also by this time begun telling my story of sobriety in the rooms of Narcotics Anonymous and Alcoholics Anonymous. However, it was about 4 years ago when the Recovery Learning Center started its Speakers Bureau. That's when I really found my voice and my passion. For the first time, I was sharing my story. And all those stigmatizing secrets, I was sharing them openly and using my story to give a face to homelessness and mental illness. Today I'm an advocate, and I still speak as part of the LEAD project, which stands for Lived Experience Advocacy Development. Along with the other members of the LEAD project, we have spoken before City Council, Board of Supervisors, and last May at the Sacramento Mental Health Day rally, we spoke to Senator Hannah Beth Jackson. These are some of my most proudest achievements in my life. But I have to say that my proudest achievement that I have to date is the fact that I am 14 years sober. And after years of being in the room and board system myself, about 4 years ago, I transitioned out and I live in a house now with a roommate who is also my best friend. I've gone back to work full-time as a homeless outreach specialist for AmeriCorps and the United Way, also TMHA. Also last year with the help of the Department of Rehabilitation, I went back to school, and pretty soon I will be it's a mouthful, certified psychiatric rehabilitation practitioner. Once again, more victories. But I am not special or unique. Recovery is for everyone. Truly, if we are really honest with ourselves, we're all in recovery from something. When I was willing to stop being silenced by others and to be honest with myself and those I loved, that was the day recovery began for me. It is the small steps, the small victories, and the daily achievement of going through life that has brought me to where I am today. Everything in my life has been leading me up to this very moment. Wherever you are at today, whatever it is you may be struggling with, don't forget to celebrate the small victories, because those small victories ultimately lead to triumphs in recovery. Thank you very much.